The mourners at Rathass Cemetery in Tralee had come to pay their respects on what should have been a day of peace. October 5th, 2022 started like any funeral day in County Kerry, with families gathering to honor the dead. But within moments, the sacred ground would be stained with blood as Thomas Dooley, a 43-year-old father of 7 from Killarney, was brutally attacked by his own family members. The knives came out in front of his wife, his children, and dozens of horrified mourners who had never seen anything like this in their lives. Quick question. Before we dive deeper, where in the world are you watching this from? Drop your location in the comments because this case shocked people far beyond Ireland's borders. Thomas Dooley died that day at the hands of people who shared his blood. But this family murder didn't happen out of nowhere. The roots of this killing stretched back through years of bitter family disputes that nobody outside the family truly understood. This is Accused, where we examine the cases that reveal how quickly family bonds can turn deadly. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button because we dive deep into cases others won't touch. This case shocked Ireland and exposed how family feuds can explode into public violence. What happened at Rathass Cemetery that day wasn't just a murder. It was a family destroying itself in the most public way possible. We'll look at the verified court evidence, the witness statements that brought 6 people to justice, and the family dynamics that led to a father of 7 bleeding out on consecrated ground while his own wife fought desperately to save his life. This is the story of how a funeral became a killing ground and how the people meant to protect Thomas Dooley became the ones who killed him. Thomas Dooley was 43 years old and a father of 7 children. Those who knew him saw him as a man trying to keep his family together while dealing with relatives who had turned hostile over time. He was originally from Killarney, a town about 30 minutes from Tralee, but his connections to the broader Dooley family network spread throughout County Kerry like roots of an old tree. The Dooley family had been dealing with serious internal conflicts that went back years. Court evidence would later reveal that these weren't just heated arguments at family gatherings, these were deep wounds that had festered between different branches of the family. Some family members had stopped speaking to each other entirely, while others maintained an uneasy peace that everyone knew could break at any moment. What made Thomas's situation particularly dangerous was that he hadn't completely cut ties with all sides of his family. While some relatives had chosen to avoid family events entirely to prevent confrontations, Thomas continued attending funerals, weddings, and other gatherings where he might encounter the family members who had grown to see him as an enemy. His wife Siobhán knew about the tensions, but like many families dealing with internal conflicts, they probably hoped that respect for tradition and sacred occasions would keep everyone civil. Thomas was married to Siobhán, and together they had built what seemed like a stable life focused on raising their 7 children. Court records show that Siobhán was deeply devoted to her husband and would prove that devotion in the most horrific way possible on October 5th, 2022. The couple had been together through years of navigating these dangerous family waters, always hoping that blood relations would eventually find a way to make peace. On that autumn day in Tralee, Thomas made what would be his final decision to attend a family funeral. He had no way of knowing that other family members had already decided this gathering would be his last. The funeral was being held for a relative that both sides of the divided family felt obligated to honor, which meant that people who had been avoiding each other for months or even years would be forced into the same small space at the same time. October 5th, 2022 began as funerals typically do in Ireland. Families gathered at Rathass Cemetery in Tralee for what was supposed to be a respectful service. Thomas Dooley arrived with his wife Siobhán, ready to pay his respects alongside other family members and friends. What happened next would be captured by witnesses and later presented in court as evidence of premeditated family violence. Multiple family members had come to the cemetery that day, and the tensions that had been building privately were about to explode into public view. The prosecution would later argue that this wasn't a spontaneous fight that got out of hand. The evidence suggested that certain family members had come prepared for violence, bringing weapons to what should have been a peaceful gathering. Court records show that the attack on Thomas wasn't random or sudden. It was planned and coordinated by people who knew exactly where he would be and when he would be most vulnerable. The attack on Thomas Dooley happened with shocking suddenness, but devastating efficiency. Witnesses who were there that day described how quickly the atmosphere changed from respectful mourning to absolute chaos. One moment, people were participating in normal funeral activities, and the next moment, family members were attacking Thomas with knives while his wife fought desperately to save his life. Court evidence revealed that multiple family members participated in the assault on Thomas. This wasn't a case where one person lost control and others tried to stop them. This was a coordinated attack by several relatives who had come to the funeral prepared for violence. The weapons they used weren't grabbed in the heat of the moment from what was available at the cemetery. They had brought them specifically for this purpose. Siobhán Dooley's response to seeing her husband under attack was immediate and fearless. Without thinking about her own safety, she threw herself between Thomas and his attackers, trying to shield him with her own body. Court testimony revealed that she fought with everything she had to protect her husband, even as she was being injured by the same knives that were killing him. The witnesses who saw Siobhán's desperate fight to save Thomas described her actions as incredibly brave, but heartbreaking to watch. She knew she was outmatched by multiple attackers with weapons, but she never stopped trying to pull her husband to safety. The injuries she suffered that day were serious enough to require medical treatment, but she survived the attack that killed the man she had tried so hard to protect. Other mourners at the funeral found themselves witnessing something they never could have imagined. Many of them had known both Thomas and his attackers for years, watching them at family gatherings, weddings, and previous funerals where everyone had managed to stay civil. The shock of seeing family members they recognized committing murder in front of children and elderly relatives was something that many witnesses struggled to process even months later during court testimony. The attack lasted only minutes, but those minutes were enough to end Thomas Dooley's life and traumatize dozens of people who had simply come to pay their respects to a deceased family member. When it was over, the sacred ground of Rathass Cemetery had been turned into a crime scene, and the family that had gathered to mourn one death now had to deal with another. Question for you. If you witnessed family members attacking another relative at a funeral, would you try to physically intervene, knowing you might get hurt, call the police, and wait for help, or try to get other family members to stop the violence? Thomas's wife, Siobhán, faced this exact choice in real time, and her decision to fight for her husband's life nearly cost her own. The Garda investigation that followed was one of the most complex family murder cases in recent Irish history. Irish police had to piece together not just what happened during those violent minutes at the cemetery, but also the years of family dynamics that had made such an attack possible. The challenge was enormous because they were dealing with a close-knit community where family loyalty often trumped cooperation with law enforcement. 6 people were ultimately brought before the courts in connection with Thomas Dooley's murder. The investigation revealed that this wasn't a case where one person lost control and others tried to stop them. This was a coordinated attack by several relatives who had come to the funeral prepared for violence. Detectives had to build their case carefully, knowing that any mistakes in handling evidence or witness testimony could allow the killers to escape justice. The challenge for investigators went beyond just identifying the attackers. They had to understand the complex web of family relationships that had led to murder, while dealing with witnesses who were traumatized by what they had seen and sometimes reluctant to testify against family members. Some witnesses initially struggled to provide complete statements because they feared retaliation from other family members or because they felt torn between seeking justice and maintaining family loyalty. Irish police also had to deal with the unique challenges of investigating a crime that had happened in front of dozens of witnesses, but where many of those witnesses were related to either the victim or the attackers. The investigation required careful handling to ensure that family pressures didn't prevent people from telling the truth about what they had witnessed that day. The breakthrough in the case came from the physical evidence and the testimony of witnesses who were willing to overcome family pressures and tell the court exactly what they had seen. The coordination and planning involved in the attack became clear through this evidence, showing that this wasn't a spontaneous fight, but a deliberate ambush carried out by people who had decided that Thomas Dooley needed to die. The case went through the Irish court system with proceedings that would reveal the true extent of the planning and coordination that went into Thomas Dooley's murder. The Central Criminal Court in Cork became the setting where the full horror of what happened at Rathass Cemetery would be laid bare for public examination. 5 adult family members and 1 teenager were ultimately convicted in connection with the murder. The court proceedings took months as prosecutors built their case piece by piece, showing how multiple relatives had worked together to plan and carry out the attack on Thomas. Each defendant faced serious charges, and the evidence against them painted a picture of a family that had chosen violence over any attempt at peaceful resolution. The court heard detailed victim impact statements that revealed the devastating effect the murder had on Thomas's immediate family. Siobhán had to tell the court about watching her husband die while she fought unsuccessfully to save him. Their 7 children, ranging in age from young to adult, had to cope with losing their father in the most traumatic way possible, knowing he was killed by people they had grown up calling family. During the trial, evidence was presented about the weapons used in the attack and the coordination required to carry out the murder in front of so many witnesses. The prosecution demonstrated that this wasn't a spontaneous fight that escalated beyond control, but a deliberate plan to kill Thomas Dooley that had been thought through and executed with multiple participants. Defense attorneys for the accused family members faced the difficult task of trying to explain how relatives could plan and carry out such a brutal attack. The court heard arguments about family tensions and disputes, but ultimately had to weigh those explanations against the evidence of premeditated murder committed in one of the most sacred settings imaginable. Witness testimony during the trial revealed details about the attack that showed just how coordinated and ruthless it was. Multiple people described seeing family members working together with weapons, while Siobhán fought alone to protect her husband. The contrast between her desperate attempts to save Thomas and the organized effort to kill him highlighted the complete breakdown of family bonds that had made this murder possible. The murder of Thomas Dooley sent shockwaves through the tight-knit community of Tralee and the broader County Kerry area. This wasn't just another violent crime that people could discuss and then forget. This was a family destroying itself in the most public and sacred setting possible. The people who witnessed the attack, including children and elderly mourners, were left dealing with trauma that would affect them for years to come. Thomas's 7 children faced the impossible task of processing their father's murder, while knowing that the people who killed him were their own extended family members. Court victim impact statements revealed how the children struggled not just with grief, but with the betrayal of trust that comes from being hurt by people who were supposed to protect and love them. Some of these children had probably played with their father's killers at family gatherings, making the psychological damage even more severe. Siobhán Dooley's recovery involved both physical healing from her injuries and psychological healing from the trauma of watching her husband die while she fought to save him. Court records show that her injuries were serious enough to require ongoing medical care, but the emotional wounds from that day ran much deeper than anything that could be treated in a hospital. The broader family network was completely shattered by what happened at Rathass Cemetery. Extended relatives, family friends, and community members who had known multiple generations of Dooleys found themselves having to choose sides or distance themselves entirely from a family that had become synonymous with public violence. Grandparents who had hoped to see their family grow and prosper instead watched it tear itself apart in the most brutal way possible. The community in Tralee struggled to understand how family relationships could deteriorate to the point where relatives would plan and execute a murder in front of children at a funeral. Local residents who had attended funerals at Rathass Cemetery for decades found themselves looking at the location differently, knowing that it had been turned into a crime scene by people who should have been there to mourn rather than to kill. The convictions brought some measure of justice, but they couldn't restore what had been destroyed that day. 6 family members now serve prison sentences for their roles in a murder that lasted only minutes, but destroyed multiple generations of a family tree that had taken decades to grow. Today, Rathass Cemetery in Tralee looks like any other Irish cemetery, peaceful, dignified, and respectful of the dead. The grass has grown back, the flowers have been replanted, and new mourners come to pay their respects to their own lost loved ones. But the people who were there on October 5th, 2022, carry memories that will never fade. They saw something that changed their understanding of how far family conflict can go when people choose violence over any attempt at peace. Thomas Dooley died that day, leaving behind 7 children who will grow up knowing their father was murdered by people they had once trusted. His death wasn't the result of random crime or bad luck. It was the deliberate choice made by family members who decided that their disputes with him were worth killing for. The weapons they brought to that funeral were meant specifically for him, and they used them while his children and wife watched in horror. The question that haunts everyone who followed this case is devastatingly simple. For what? What family disagreement could possibly justify bringing knives to a funeral and stabbing a father of 7 in front of his children? 6 people now serve prison sentences for their roles in a murder that lasted minutes but destroyed generations of family relationships that had taken decades to build. Siobhán Dooley showed incredible courage that day, fighting to save her husband's life even when she was outnumbered and outmatched by attackers with weapons. Her bravery couldn't save Thomas, but it demonstrated the kind of love and loyalty that his killers had abandoned when they chose murder over family bonds. She survived the attack, but she has to live with the memory of fighting a battle she couldn't win while watching the father of her 7 children die at the hands of his own relatives. The Thomas Dooley case stands as one of the most shocking examples of family violence in recent Irish criminal history. It revealed how family feuds can fester and grow until they explode into public murder, even in the most sacred settings. For anyone trying to understand how families can turn this toxic, this case provides a tragic blueprint of how disputes can escalate when people choose pride and revenge over forgiveness and peace. The children Thomas left behind will carry this trauma for the rest of their lives. They lost their father, but they also lost their faith in family safety and trust. The people who should have been their protectors became their father's killers, creating wounds that will probably never fully heal. The 7 Dooley children represent the real cost of family violence, innocent lives damaged by adult choices they had no power to influence or prevent. Tomorrow we'll examine another case where family loyalty became family betrayal, looking at how domestic disputes can turn deadly when people choose violence over communication. Subscribe to Accused for cases that reveal the darkness hidden in families. And remember that the people closest to us can sometimes become the greatest threats to our survival. And remember Thomas Dooley, a father who went to honor a deceased relative and never came home because the people who killed him had been invited to the same gathering. His death serves as a reminder that even the most sacred spaces aren't safe when families abandon love and choose murder. The cemetery where he died remains a place where people come to mourn, but for his family, It will always be the place where their world was destroyed by people they had once trusted with their lives.